I've been invited to talk about teaching games for understanding, and Sergio introduced me as an expert in the area. I'm not entirely sure what qualifies me to be an expert, other than that I'm just really interested in it. I've been interested in TGfU since I first came across it about 20 years ago. Like Sergio, I've been trying to apply these ideas in my own coaching. And also I'm in a fortunate position that I get to teach young coaches about this, or well, not always young coaches, but undergraduate and postgraduate coaches in our courses. So I spend quite a lot of time trying to introduce these ideas to other people. So hopefully I can do that effectively today. Ruin, my colleague, will follow up on my session, and Ruin's the real expert. Ruin's the guy with the PhD in the subject area. So I'm going to try to be quick so I can preserve as much time as possible for Ruin to talk about this. So Sergio mentioned this a little earlier, but what we can see here on the slide is a picture. So who knows what this is a picture of? Any takers? Colleagues?
I have no idea.
It's a broad church. A broad church. So I could have put a picture of the TV series on, but I didn't think that would have been as effective. So yeah, the first thing I want to say is that TGfU is a broad church. It's a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And I'm saying that because the version of events I'm going to give you now might be different to the ones that you've read about, or might be different to the ones you've heard about. So yeah, it's just sort of making that caveat before I start, really. Sergio mentioned this, the history, or just a very, very brief history of TGfU, Teaching Games for Understanding, really was the brainchild of the three guys that you can see here in the picture. So from left to right, we've got Rod Thorpe, Dave Bunker, and Len Almond, who unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago. And it was really through Len that I got interested in TGfU. So I've been playing about with TGfU for ideas for a long time, and I eventually plucked up the courage to submit an abstract for a conference, and Len was on the committee, and he emailed me after he'd read my abstract and said he'd really enjoyed it. And we struck up a bit of a friendship, and we spent years then talking about this together. So Len was a personal friend of mine, and somebody who really got me deeply interested in TGfU after being sort of playing about with it for a little while. These guys worked together at Leeds University in the 1980s, which is where TGfU was kind of born as an idea. Rod and Dave had been influenced by the guy in the black and white picture there. This is Alan Wade, the former technical director at the FA, but also a Loughborough alumni who influenced these guys in terms of, fairly radical ideas at the time that you could teach tactics through gameplay and principles of play and so on. And Len was influenced by these guys that I've got pictures of here. So we've got, first from the right, we've got Jerome Bruner, who's the Harvard professor of educational psychology, and Bernard Suits. And Len brought these other influences in, which were sort of broader influences about curriculum design and understanding the nature of games. And he was influenced by, Bruner and Suits in his thinking. And so together they brought, and those things are important because I'm going to mention them a little bit later, in that I think the two big ideas that I take from TGfU go back to people like Alan Wade and go back to people like Bruner and Suits. So if you wanted to do some background reading, then those aren't bad sources to go to. So of course, these guys published their work and their thinking about teaching games for understanding, initially in PE in the UK, but really, as Sergio mentioned, it's become a really big worldwide movement. So there's TGfU researchers and practitioners all over the world now, particularly in the sort of, Australia and New Zealand, there's a big movement, and Canada and North America, and also in Europe and places like Portugal and Spain. So TGfU is really a kind of a worldwide movement now, but it began in Loughborough in the 1980s. I mentioned there's two big ideas that I take from TGfU. This is the first one. I'm going to sort of flip-flop between these two a little bit, but the first big idea, which is the one that I think is probably most commonly known about or understood, is the curriculum model. So one of the big ideas that came from the TGfU movement was the curriculum model, which is the idea that, as you can see here right at the top, that you begin a session. So if you're coaching a session, you can begin with a game, which was, again, a radical thought in the 1980s. The game was normally something that you save until the end of your session as a reward if the children or athletes had done well in the skills practices. So the idea of beginning with a game, and beginning with a game that was modified to suit the needs of the learner was an important idea. And then if you follow the model round from anti-clockwise, we've got game appreciation and tactical awareness. The idea is that young people play these games, these modified games, and develop an appreciation of what is the game. What is it to play the game? How do you outwit your opponent in the game? And through that, they develop some awareness of the tactics of the game. You would then, as a coach or teacher, maybe break out of those games and ask questions. So questions about the decisions that children are making. What are you doing? How do you do it? When might you do that? And at that point, that might be an appropriate time then to start to develop skills. So what are the skills required to solve the problems of the game? And once we've understood what those skills might be in context, we can practice them. But the idea was you would do that afterwards, after the children had appreciated why that skill was an important skill to develop. That, of course, then once they can do that, they can perform the skill better, which hopefully enables them to move on to a more advanced form of the game. And then the cycle kind of continues. So this idea of the curriculum model, this cycle of how you might deliver in the course of a session, was quite a radical departure from what was typically being done back in the 70s and early 80s, and probably is to a certain extent today. So, I wanted just to focus on this a little bit though, because when we kind of teach this to our students, we perhaps I don't think we take pay adequate attention to this relationship. So understanding, or trying to understand how to represent the game to the learner based on their age and stage of development, based on their cognitive ability, based on their movement ability, actually getting the game right, pitching that initial game at the right level to make it engaging and interesting and fun and challenging, and representative of the real game, but without obviously being the real thing, because that might be too complex, is a really difficult task. And it's something that we spend quite a lot of time thinking about and teaching about in our programs. One thing that helps us is this. So moving on to the second big idea at TGfU for me is to help us understand what we mean by games. What is the game? And just at the top of the slide here, you can see there's four what are known as the pedagogical principles. Exaggeration, sampling, and representation. And I've made sampling and representation a bit bigger here because they're just a bit more important for what I want to say next. So the idea is that when I'm creating that game, that initial game, I want children, I want my athletes, young people, to be able to sample lots of different types of games. And one of the things that particularly Len Almond did and led on was to help us think about, well, classifications of games. So you can see here on the slide, there's an arrow, and you're probably familiar with this classification that we've got going from right to left. So target sports in yellow, striking and fielding games in green, net and war games in blue, and invasion or territorial invasion games in red. And so what Len did was he drew on Bernard Suitzer's definition of what is a game. This idea that a game is the attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles. So through that analysis, Len was able to kind of look at games and think about, well, some of these games have similar goals and they have similar rules. And that means that the problems that they present to the players are similar. And we can put them in families or categories based on that similarity. So that's where this classification of games comes from. And so the idea of sampling is that we want to expose young people to lots of different types of games, or game forms, as we might call them. And in doing so, what we want to do is introduce them to the what we might call the internal logic of those games, or some of the high-level principles or problems that those games present to young people, to get them interested. We want them to be interested in games. We want them to love playing games, and we want them to become lifelong participants at any level. And so that's the first part, sampling. I want to sample lots of different types of games, and we can think about games in families, because then we can sample sports from different families. The second point of representation is that I need, in my session, so back to my game learner connection, when I'm developing a game, or modified, simplified game, I need to reduce the tactical complexity of that. And one way I can do that is by, while still representing the real game, is by thinking about, well, what are the fundamental problems this game presents, or this type of game presents to the participants? So again, if we go from the simplest, so target sports being the simplest or the least tactically complex game form, it's things like, well, how do we judge angle and trajectory of an implement? How do we judge speed and distance? And how do we judge risk and reward, or make risk-reward decisions? If you think about striking fielding games, it's simple. We've got batting and fielding interactions, and the batting team are trying to figure out how to score more runs by hitting and running, and the fielding team are trying to figure out how to prevent runs through pitching and fielding. If you think about net and war games, again, very simply, we've got a net, and we've got balls either on my side of the net, it's on the other side. And when it's on my side, I'm trying to maximize the space and time I've got. And when it's on my opponent's side, I'm trying to reduce the amount of space and time that they've got to play. And then finally, invasion games, typically we work through cycles of attacking and defense. And the key problems are, when I'm attacking, is, well, do I conserve the ball? Do I keep possession? Or do we try and take a risk and penetrate and move the ball forward? And equally, when we're defending, we've got to decide whether we're going to press the ball high up the pitch and try and force a mistake or a turnover, or we're going to drop deep and defend close to our own goal. So the idea is that we would want children to sample lots of different types of games, and we'd want them to fall in love with those games and appreciate the internal logic that I've described on the slide here. So through playing those games, they learn to appreciate some of these key problems, and they learn to start to solve these problems through the games that we present to them. So those are the two kind of big ideas for me. It's the curriculum model with the game at the center, and the game being developed appropriate to the level of the learner. And then the second big idea is this idea of game forms and these families of games, and that through a curriculum, we want to introduce children to all the different forms of games and appreciate the internal logic and become really effective, adaptable games players. So yeah, that's it from me. I'll